This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest this week is Mary Fran T Malone. She's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of New Hampshire, where she teaches classes on democracy, comparative politics, and Latin American politics. Her research focuses on a crucial component of democracy and establishing the rule of law. Most recently, her book, brought out in 2023, Making Police Reform Matter in Latin America. So, of course, very poignant at this time. Welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure because we need to talk about Costa Rica, which to so many people, we think of it as the remanso de paz, or the calm, peaceful country in Central and obviously South America as well. You know, the country with no armed forces, well, on the surface at the very least, but it's going through some challenging times. Perhaps you could give us some background on this, Mary Fran.
Sure, absolutely. So what's really grabbing the headlines these days is kind of the surge in violent crime, especially homicides that have taken place in Costa Rica, especially over the past 5 years, right? So we see that, once the pandemic ends, we actually see that there's a sharp uptick in homicide rates. I would say that that's kind of part of a larger trend. Costa Rica had really low homicide rates throughout the 1990s, pretty much on par with the United States, I would say, which for the region is quite low. And then we actually start to see those increase in the early 2000s. And by 2010, people were already kind of talking about a security crisis back in 2010. So I would say that what we're seeing right now is a really, sharp uptick in violent crimes, homicides, especially those linked to organized criminal activity. So those grab a lot of attention. Those are the ones that people talk about. But I would say that the actual uptick in crime kind of goes back to the 2000 teens, I would say.
Really? And what do we attribute this rise then so far back? Because we don't think so far back in Costa Rica in this term.
So I would say there's kind of domestic, kind of long-term causes, as well as kind of more recent international causes, right? Mm-hmm. So when you look at what's happening now, and again, this kind of started in the 2000 teens, what you see is that there's been a growth in organized criminal activity in Costa Rica. And that's actually that's kind of an international factor, right? Mm-hmm. Costa Rica becomes more important in the global drug trade, for example, as a transit country, starting in the 2000 teens. You also see that there's kinds of more organized criminal activity in the region kind of starting to infiltrate Costa Rica starting in the 2000 teens. And that actually is kind of largely out of Costa Rica's control, right? So as the cocaine market, particularly in Europe, actually increases, Costa Rica is well placed to serve as a major transit area to get that cocaine there, right? So that doesn't really have as much to do with Costa Rica. It's more its kind of geographical location and what's happening in international illicit markets. So I would say that kind of is one factor. I would say that the kind of other kind of key factor that's domestic and kind of structural is that starting in the 1990s, we start to see rates of inequality increase in Costa Rica. If you remember, 1990s was the decade of neoliberal reforms. Costa Rica actually tried to kind of curb the impact of those neoliberal reforms, probably more than more countries did. But I would say that, by and large, in the 1990s, we see a fundamental restructuring of the Costa Rican economy that really lends itself to high levels of inequality. And I remember kind of reading a lot in the 1990s, early 2000s of policymakers in Costa Rica kind of warning that if we continue with these economic reforms and we don't address their impact on inequality, long term, we're going to have problems like more insecurity. We're going to have more marginalized people. So, so that was kind of already, a warning back in the early 2000s. When I was just in Costa Rica last summer, I kind of spoke with some people that had said, we were the people that were saying, if you don't address these levels of inequality, we're going to have more problems, right? We're going to have societal problems, especially in terms of security and crime. And they're kind of frustrated because they're like, this is 30 years in the making, right? So on one hand, you see that there's kind of domestic changes in Costa Rica. I think last time I checked, Costa Rica was the third most unequal country in the hemisphere, right? So really, and again, that's not what Costa Rica used to be, right? Costa Rica was one of the first welfare states in the region. It actually usually had really strong social protections, services for citizens. That starts to get kind of gradually chipped away at in the 1990s. And that's when you also start to see these rates of inequality increase. So now Costa Rica is highly unequal. And some of these kind of problems that we're seeing tend to be focused in countries with higher levels of inequality.
So, I mean, we don't liken it entirely to sort of countries in the region like Honduras or Guatemala, but it's certainly going down that pathway.
So I would say Costa Rica is interesting because you don't necessarily see high rates of poverty like you see in Honduras, for example. But what you do see is actually a growing gap between people of socioeconomic status, right? So you actually do see, in terms of overall inequality, a sharp uptick, even though levels of poverty have been much lower than the kind of regional counterparts.
This is interesting. I was there in, I think it was 2000, 2001, having spent significant time in other Central American countries. And I think I could recognize that. I always felt that this belief of Costa Rica as this entirely inclusive and equal society was somewhat built on very shaky ground. Sadly so. But if you talk about the 2010s when this is all kicking off or actually becoming more visible, let's say, to international watchers and, of course, the local population. And this plays into inequality. And then later on, of course, we have these perfect storms of what's going on around Costa Rica. Look at Nicaragua, look at El Salvador, look at Honduras. How much does this play into this instability?
Yeah, so I would say that most certainly when I think about international factors affecting Costa Rican security, I would say it's more its geographical position in the kind of global drug market, right?
Okay.
Just that it's a valuable transit station. I would say that when you're looking at kind of the impact of, say, Honduras or Nicaraguan politics on Costa Rica, I would say that tends to be much less. If anything, Costa Rica has always been a destination country for Nicaraguan migrants. So I think in the 2010s, I think there were, if you counted both the documented and undocumented population, experts thought that about 10% of the Costa Rican population was originally born in Nicaragua. So you actually see that kind of strong migrant community. And, you did have some, public perceptions that Nicaraguans were, kind of responsible for the uptick in crime. I would say that over time, though, as that immigrant community became more at home in Costa Rica, you see far less of that. So there was kind of like a lot of alarm about Nicaraguan migration. Are they leading to more crime in the 2010s? And today you just see far less of that, right? If anything, as people kind of have more Nicaraguan neighbors, they just kind of say they recognize that this is just not really a problem, right? So, and I would say that in terms of what's happening within Nicaragua, what's interesting is that Nicaragua actually had always been a pretty safe country as well, right? So you do see some organized criminal activity, but in terms of rates of violent crime and homicide, those, if anything, have been lower than Costa Rica historically, right? So you don't really see those same problems. In the case of Honduras, by and large, the gang problem that really was prevalent in Honduras didn't really have as much of an impact in Costa Rica. For example, if you look at kind of regional trends, you do see kind of the gang activity that starts in El Salvador spreading to Honduras, but you don't see that same kind of transmission to Costa Rica. And I would just say that, a lot of that had to do with the fact that in the 2010s, it was still kind of hard to gain traction, right? And those kinds of gang groups, they don't have the same levels of sophistication as you would say with an organized criminal group, a cartel, a drug trafficking organization. Those tend to actually be kind of a smaller level of organization. And by and large, they just don't really get much traction in Costa Rica, right? I think if anything, Costa Rican institutions were really strong enough to kind of insulate Costa Rica from some of those trends that we saw with the Maras in El Salvador and Honduras.
Well, that's a relief there. And COVID, of course, plays its part when we think of the inequality.
Yes, absolutely. And Costa Rica, if anything, didn't have some of the more stringent government restrictions that we saw in places like Chile and Argentina, right, where you sometimes needed a pass to be able to walk your dog in the afternoon, right? Costa Rica, if anything, had far more moderate restrictions during COVID, which also meant that the impact on economic activity was less than in some other countries, right? So you did see some restrictions in terms of how many people could drive into San Jose, for example. But, by and large, people were able to go to parks, they were able to walk around. You didn't see that same type of severe limitation that then, not only cuts personal movement, but also then, of course, has economic implications, right?
And of course, this feeds in perfectly when we talk about the virus, the pandemic, and of course, the collapse in law and order in Venezuela. Can we discuss migration from that part of the world and indeed the Tren de Aragua? Is that affecting Costa Rica?
Yes. So It depends on who you ask. So some people say yes, some people say not as much, right? So as I mentioned, Costa Rica had long been a destination country for Nicaraguan migrants. In some cases, those were political migrants, right? So you do see migration in the 1980s as people are fleeing the Contra War. By the 1990s, early 2000s, they're overwhelmingly economic migrants, right? So they're coming to Costa Rica to work typically as kind of, private security guards, cleaning services, house care, daycare, those types of activities, right? So I would say that had kind of, and by now, I would say that any kind of misgivings about that type of migration really have kind of been subsided in Costa Rica. So you saw kind of, as I mentioned, alarms in 2010s, but not really as much today about that type of migration. The other type of migration, though, is more transitory, right? When I was interviewing some government officials last summer in Costa Rica, what they said was that, we sometimes see problems associated with that kind of, transit migration. But by and large, they say typically those migrants don't want to stay in Costa Rica, right? So they're not seeking to stay here. What they're aiming to do is actually get to the United States, right? So in terms of Venezuelan migrants, Panamanian migrants, people kind of, passing the Darien Gap and coming through Panama into Costa Rica, officials said by and large, they don't really stay here. So as long as you have kind of reasonable public security measures, that type of migration ends up not really being long-term particularly problematic, right? People I spoke with said that, Costa Rica is right now an expensive country to live in, right? So if you're a migrant, you really don't want to stay in Costa Rica. You actually want to get someplace else where you're just going to have more viable economic prospects. So I would say that there were some concerns that kind of open door, that migration could perhaps create problems, but I would say I think people perceive that as being far less of a problem than, say, trends in organized criminal activity.
Okay. So we have the government of President Chaves in power, and he came into office in 2022. What has he done? What has his government done to address the rise in homicides and let's say criminal gangs?
Great question. So I would say that Chavez is another figure that people's perceptions tend to vary quite dramatically depending upon where they sit, right? So I would say that, objectively, when Chavez comes in, there have been there's already kind of people raising the alarm about security. There had kind of been a dip in 2022 in both the kind of rates of violent crime as well as people's worries about violent crime. So 2022, people really weren't worried about it as much. Economic factors were actually more kind of in the public consciousness as problems. And then I would say that when Chavez comes in, everybody's clear that security is going to be the issue, right? So I would say that when you kind of think about what he's done, basically a lot of it is rhetoric, right? So I think one of the ways Chavez gets appeal, like kind of other pseudo-populists, is that he has the rhetoric that resonates with people who are really frustrated by high rates of violent crime, right? So he comes in and he says, I'm tired of the ley de pobrecita, that we always have to think about, those poor people, they had bad lives, that's why they're engaging in crime. They actually need to be, just held accountable, right? We need to hit them firm, right? So I would say that rhetoric does resonate with a lot of people who are frustrated with high rates of crime, right? He also kind of is very quick to disparage other institutions that people feel like are getting in the way, and kind of elites in Costa Rica, right? So I think that a lot of the appeal that he has sometimes is not so much what he's done, it's actually the way that he kind of frames the rhetoric. Now, in terms of kind of concrete measures of what he's done, the reality is not a whole lot, right? So, that's different at least, right? Not a whole lot that's different. So, he talks about being harsher. He wanted to pass laws where you would increase jail time, that you would give, courts greater leeway in trying minors as adults, that you would, build more prisons. Of course, we just see him now talking about having his own mega prison, right? So these things, which we kind of call mano dura, iron fist tactics, by and large, they end up not really having much of an impact, right? So, and if you kind of talk with people working in the justice system in Costa Rica, they'll say that, that language kind of resonates with people who are kind of frustrated with, security in Costa Rica. But what citizens don't sometimes realize is that like penalties in Costa Rica for many of these crimes are already really high, right? So people who work in the justice system say that Costa Rica has some of the harshest laws about people who sell drugs, even at the lowest level, right? People who consume drugs, right? So they said already we kind of have a justice system that tends to penalize people who engage, especially in drug-related crimes, quite severely. So when people say, oh, we should do more, they're like, well, we don't really know what more we're supposed to do, right? So, and I think some of the crimes that people get frustrated with are oftentimes crimes that it is difficult to actually get them successfully through the court system for lack of evidence, right? So for example, if you're walking in San Jose and somebody steals your backpack with your iPhone and your money and all those things in it, that really hurts, right? Because of course those are valuable items, and now someone just stole them. But the reality is that for the police to, if there's not active patrolling to kind of prevent those types of crime in the first place, for people to find the exact person that stole your backpack, recover your items, and then have all that proof in place to take that case through the court system, those crimes by nature just tend to be harder to prove, right, than something like a homicide or a house robbery, those types of things.
Yeah.
So people are frustrated. That rhetoric kind of appeals to them. They want harsher penalties. But at the end of the day, those things not really solving the crime crisis, right? And people like them in Costa Rica the same way they like them in the United States and other countries. But if you're actually really interested in reducing crime, those types of measures end up usually not really helping a whole lot, right? So usually things that actually address kind of marginalization, resources, those things actually tend to have far more of a long-term impact than, we're going to try this child as an adult and we're going to stick them in jail for 15 years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I can see this rhetoric of tough on crime and of obviously strong security measures. It is really a broader trend in the whole region, of course, is talking. Chaves, as we know, and this is a moment in our conversation where we have to bring up President Bukele. Chaves has, of course, expressed openly his admiration of President Bukele's measures. Any possibility that Chaves might actually bring in some of those measures, or is it, again, more rhetoric?
So that's a great question, because he gave Bukele the country's highest honor back in November, right? He wants to build his own mega prison. He talks about how they're collaborating to get the cost of constructing this mega prison down. So he's been very open with his admiration of Bukele. Together with my research team, we had conducted a series of focus groups in Costa Rica in May and June of 2024 to see how much these measures would actually resonate with people. And when we kind of conducted our focus groups in the San Jose region, by and large, we saw people in Costa Rica were okay with emulating this idea of incarcerating more people, having stricter laws, giving police and the judiciary more discretion in actually trying crimes and holding perceived criminals accountable. That type of thing, there was a lot of support for. But when you actually start talking about some of the other measures that Bukele has, like suspending due process, sending militarized forces into the streets, that people in Costa Rica were like, that's completely at odds with our identity, right? So in Costa Rica, you still saw people, you mentioned, did you want to actually restart the military, right? Kind of, have the military build it from scratch in 2024. And overwhelmingly respondents were like, absolutely not. That is so antithetical to Costa Rican national identity, to who we are as Costa Ricans, that they really were never willing to kind of go that far. So I think when we kind of talk about, mano dura, iron fist, policies in Costa Rica, what we see among the public is that there's support for kind of the legal part of that. So like anything you can do with the laws to make them tougher on criminals, right? But if you start talking about things that are extra legal, like allowing the police to, use indiscriminate force or kind of looking the other way when we're kind of violating someone's rights, that had zero traction, right? It was interesting in the focus group, sometimes you'd see someone say, well, we have to do that, otherwise we'll end up like Ecuador. And the other people in the group, typically there was like a moderating effect where they were like, whoa, well, let's hold back on that. Let's kind of think other things through, because if we start going down that path, basically we're going to, start kind of losing what makes us, really important as a democratic nation.
It's good to hear that Costa Rica retains the identity that it seems to be universal. This is a very positive in this moment where not too much positive seems to be coming out. And talk about Chaves. We've got elections coming up next year, February next year. What when he got in 2022, what were his policy objectives? I mean, what did he run on? Has he fulfilled them?
Great question. So, and to give him credit, I mean, he has, in terms of security, he has actually increased port security, right? So he's actually increased the use of technology to scan packages before they leave ports. So, I mean, those things, I do want to give him credit for those types of measures that, actually long term could be very effective. But I would say that, when he came in, a lot of it was more kind of, there was concern about security, there was concern about the economy. But I would say that when you kind of look at the people, especially people who supported Chaves, a lot of it was that they were frustrated with the status quo in Costa Rica, right? And that's where I think Chaves fits nicely with the other populists that we see, that they were really frustrated that there perceived to be this kind of group of elites that was monopolizing power, monopolizing wealth and resources, that this elite class was out of touch with the problems that average Costa Ricans had. There was frustration that social services had declined, the quality of education and health had declined. These types of things, there was frustration that Costa Rica was in decline as opposed to kind of being the beacon in the hemisphere that it used to be, especially in the 1990s, right? So I would say that, Chavez's victory did reflect kind of people's concerns about basic problems like security in the economy. But I think it also reflected the fact that people were frustrated with this kind of what they perceived to be an out of touch governing class, right? And they wanted to have change.
The out of touch governing class is this broader trend through this whole region. I can see this repeating itself over and over. You can transplant the issues and the complaints of the Costa Rican people to almost anywhere. And we talk positively about the economy. We talk positively. The IMF has praised Costa Rica.
So that's true, and most certainly we do see that there's been better economic growth in Costa Rica than there has been in other countries. There's been a reduction in deficit, which is what the IMF always wants, right? A reduction in deficit, right? So, but the thing when we talk about those economic indicators, I would just kind of keep going back to this issue of inequality, right? So, if you have economic growth, but your levels of inequality rise, what that means is that, yes, the country on average is doing better, but a lot of people are being left out of that progress. And I think what we're seeing happening is that if people feel that they're left out of that progress, that they're not getting part of that economic benefit, first of all, they're going to keep voting for populists who are anti-elite, right? Because they're not benefiting from this economic progress. But then also you're just leaving more people marginalized, right? And if you look at economic indicators at the subnational level, what we see is that there's really sharp pockets of inequality, right? Especially in poor areas, right? And I would say that, for example, when you see these kinds of patterns, what it means is that in areas where organized criminal groups are looking to expand their activities, they're encountering, more marginalized youth who actually don't have as much access as they used to quality education, to healthcare, to services like, basic, community infrastructure. And what that means is that, yes, there's economic growth, but it's not evenly distributed and it's leaving some people behind. And those people who are left behind are oftentimes easily recruited into organized criminal activity. They're also kind of more likely to vote for populist leaders, right? So I think that when we talk about economic progress, great that we want, we have economic growth, great that we have a reduction in debt. But I would just also think that indicator of inequality is one that we really have to have on the radar.
I think that obviously we would be looking very directly at a town like Limon in this situation. I mean, it seems to me that being the perfect example of people being left behind. And let's talk a little bit about the tax reform. The tax reform from the previous government. It seems like Chaves wants to claim credit for this.
Well, that tends to be the trend, right? So, and people tend to give credit for good economic indicators to the person who's in power, and they tend to penalize and do the opposite as well, right? When the economy's bad, whoever's in power now gets penalized. So, I think that's how people tend to perceive these things, right? And if you say, we see this in the United States today, right? Like if you say, oh, hey, this economic reform, if we have it right now, 5 years from now, it's going to increase the debt. It's going to have a whole series of negative consequences. 5 years from now, people are going to say, oh, no, it's the person's fault who's in power right now. So I think that's how people kind of attribute economic success and economic failures, is that they want to kind of have immediate attribution. And sometimes they don't look at these kind of, more long-term structural factors.
Definitely. Let's talk about the elections. 2026, big year. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of a rundown on what's going on.
Great. So when I think about the elections in 2026, I guess I see them kind of in kind of a global trend, right? So I think globally what we're seeing is a rise in more authoritarian style leaders. And I say authoritarian style because sometimes the rhetoric just sounds authoritarian, but in practice, they're not abusing the law. They're not, they're acting legally. So it's not that they're, undermining democracy. So, but sometimes their rhetoric just makes them sound more authoritarian. I guess I would put Chaves in that category, right? So it's true that some of his measures and things he's proposed have kind of, well, the Supreme Court has said they're unconstitutional, right? But then we see that he then respects the Supreme Court's kind of decision there, right? So I would say his rhetoric tends to be very combative. But in practice, I wouldn't say he's done anything openly authoritarian, right? It's just kind of more that rhetoric. And I guess globally, that's kind of what we see, is that these types of leaders are gaining a lot of traction and they're really kind of building constituencies, right? And I think people, when you look at, for example, the case of the United States in 2016, people thought, it's just a one-off thing, right? The ship's going to right itself. It was kind of a crazy fluke, right? And I think we're seeing now, not just within countries, but also globally, is it's not a fluke, right? That, globally, there's a group of people who feel, disenfranchised and marginalized. And they find that this type of rhetoric, these leaders, they're going to be the one to fix these problems. So I guess when I look at Costa Rica, I don't see any changes in terms of people who feel that they've been marginalized or not benefiting from the economic progress. We actually see people who are still very, very afraid of just the problems of insecurity. So what I think that's going to do is really create fertile ground for another outsider, right? So another kind of more populist style figure to actually really kind of try to capitalize on the same kind of discontent that Chavez was able to capitalize on.
Definitely. I mean, we can see this. I'm where I'm located here in Colombia. We're very likely to slide that way. And of course, look at President Noboa in Ecuador. Look, it would be a reason why President Boluarte remains in power in Peru. And of course, Bukele in El Salvador, Nicaragua. I mean, we know what's going on there. It just seems to repeat itself over and over. And we don't think that, I mean, Chavez has been affected by the corruption scandals, and anyone can build on that as well. An authoritarian style candidate can also point to the corruption scandals.
Right. Absolutely. And you can actually see kind of one political outsider, pointing that this political outsider is, being corrupt and doing the same thing as the other elites. Right. I think the, kind of rhetoric that sometimes people use in those political challengers use in those scenarios is, once he got to power, he was just as bad as the other ones. Right. So, you have to have somebody new in there. So I would say that, the ground is really fertile to kind of have that type of figure be successful in 2026. I think a lot of it's going to have to do with how the traditional political parties reinvent themselves, right? And part of it, I think, is just kind of, human nature, right? When you have two political parties that kind of share power for decades, people get frustrated, right? And they kind of say they want something new, right? They tend not to view that as, oh, great, we have all the stability. It's that they're like, oh, we need somebody new in there, right? So part of it's kind of, I think, just human nature. But then the other part of it is that those traditional political parties really do need to demonstrate that they're willing to reinvent themselves and kind of respond to the people who feel that they've been left behind, right? And that's something that I think that political parties and elites did successfully in other parts of Costa Rican history. So, for example, in the 2000 teens, I actually thought that Costa Rican elites and traditional parties did a great job of, kind of saying, look, this is not our identity. We have to kind of shield ourselves against these kind of rising populists, and we're actually going to be working on your behalf. I feel like they were less successful in doing that in the past 5 years, right? In the past 5 years, we actually see that the traditional political parties have allowed themselves to kind of be painted as kind of out of touch. And I think that they really need to reinvent themselves to kind of appeal more to kind of average Costa Ricans who are frustrated.
Well, that's it. It would be, again, appealing to the base, appealing to the left out, the marginalized, and not easy for the traditional parties to do so. Not easy to breach that gap.
Well, it's funny. So when I think about, I first started working in Costa Rica in, I think maybe 2010, around then. And I was actually always really impressed that the kind of elites that I talked to in Costa Rican government, how much they actually thought about average people. So, I mean, this is just one, kind of small example, but I was going to the electoral tribunal, and I was actually learning about how that's, Costa Rica, that's a fourth branch of government. And we actually went through, how from getting a national ID card to counting the votes, I was kind of getting a tour of how everything worked there. And it was fascinating. And what amazed me was, I remember we went into the lobby and there was all this artwork there, right? And I was like, well, this is lovely. But, in the US, we usually don't think of government institutions this way. And I remember the person who was in charge at the time said, oh, well, we try to do that because, people come here and sometimes they have to wait a really long period of time while they're waiting in line for their ID cards. And a lot of them maybe don't have access to museums and art and stuff. So isn't it nice that we make it available to the public? Right? And again, this is just such a small example, but it struck me because I don't think I would ever hear someone in the US working in government talk about it that way, right? It just was a very different way of thinking about it. And for me, I was like, wow, it's kind of interesting that whoever's in charge of, organizing this particular office was like, hey, let's bring in some artwork so average people have more access to it. And this way they're not going to get frustrated when they wait, right? So I felt like that very, very small example kind of illustrated how many Costa Rican elites kind of thought about their jobs, right? And, they really kind of did try to make sure that even kind of on a larger scale, neoliberal reforms had less of an impact in Costa Rica than they did in other places, right? They really did try to think about ways in which they could kind of insulate people who were going to be most vulnerable from major, economic change. So I guess I felt like Costa Ricans always did that. And I felt too, the other thing was that they were always very pragmatic. So when you kind of talk with Costa Rican elites about policy, they were by and large, I mean, I interviewed people and they said, I disagree with him on everything, but at the end of the day, he won, so I have to work with him. So, we're going to just focus on where we agree. And when I disagree, I'm going to find a nice way to try to say it, right? So I felt like there had always been a pragmatism and kind of an interest in investing in people in Costa Rican politics. And I can't say that that's completely disappeared. Like, I think when I go back and talk to people, I still see those trends, but I think that they're not as obvious to people who feel left out, right? So I feel that when they're looking, they just see this wealthier elite class who actually is benefiting more than they are. I would also say that when you kind of look at the kind of politicians and kind of more elite class in Costa Rica, a lot of times when they compare themselves, they kind of compare themselves to their counterparts in Europe and the United States, right? So for example, if they have a high salary, they're like, right, well, that's what people in my job should have, right? Like I should have kind of a similar compensation package as we see in other areas. I should have a similar lifestyle as we see in the United States and Europe and those countries. And I think in Costa Rica, especially if you're at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder, you just see that they have a lot more than you do, right? Not that this is what professionals have, it's that they have far more than you do.
It's that moment where we have to talk about the relationship between the United States government and Costa Rica right now. And obviously, what is an interesting situation, obviously, is Costa Rica moving from Taiwan to China with its political relationship, and how this plays in with the relationship with President Trump's government. But of course, they've played their hand quite well. They've moved to China, but they are receiving these transfers of migrants on the way south. So would you say this has been, a good play?
So I would say that's kind of emblematic of kind of Costa Rican pragmatism, right? So so basically, and this is, I think, what the governing class does very, very well, is I think that if you look at kind of Costa Rican ties to the U.S., I mean, a lot of Costa Rican elites have gone to the United States for education. They're actually very well connected in U.S. circles. So for them, yes, they actually would see that continuing this beneficial relationship with the United States is being great, right? We see that they've actually been able to press the United States, even as the United States is cutting funds everywhere, press the United States to actually devote more attention to resources for combating organized crime, for working with the FBI, DEA. So we actually see more resources kind of going there. I would say that if you kind of juxtapose that with what's happening with China, again, that's a relationship that the Chinese in particular have been trying to steadily build since the early 2000s, right? So I remember the first time I was in Costa Rica, they had started construction on the soccer stadium, which was that gift from the Chinese government, right? And people talked about how, oh, wow, I remember people being like, oh, it's so strange. Like, we don't usually have a lot of Chinese people here, right? I mean, so they were like, oh, wow, it was something noticeable. And you started to see kind of more Asian supermarkets. And they were like, oh, yeah, because the people working on the stadium also want to have, okay. And when I was there in July 2024, I remember I walked around Chinatown in Costa Rica and I was like, wow, this has really expanded a lot, because now it's not just, the people that are associated with the stadium the way it was 15 years ago. Now it's actually that there's been a real growth in kind of just the visible presence of not just the Chinese government, but people from China living in Costa Rica, right? So I guess it's been a steady relationship. It's been economically based for the most part. And I think that it's grown over time, and people in Costa Rica are kind of willing to pursue both options, right? They don't see those things as mutually exclusive, right? China's actually meeting one particular need. The United States is meeting another. It would actually, I think Costa Rica would seek to continue collaboration with both of those countries by saying this is where our interests overlap in this area, and this is where they overlap in another.
Again, it comes back to that identity. The Costa Ricans are entirely sure of their identity, and this pragmatism is quite refreshing indeed. I forgive my ignorance. Where is Chinatown in San Jose?
Oh, goodness. So actually, I don't know if it's officially Chinatown, but it's most certainly where you see a concentration of a lot of Asian businesses, restaurants, et cetera. And it is several blocks long. So I'm trying to think, if you're if you're kind of in the area where the government buildings are, if you're coming from the main park, it's actually to the right-hand side, right? So it's like, so, but I remember this big statue that represented the friendship between the Chinese and Costa Rican peoples. And again, it's a commercial sector that's quite large, that I at least don't recall it being as visible when I first started working in Costa Rica.
And how, obviously things things are not going too great. China and Panama, obviously there's been a little bit of an upset there in that relationship, but Costa Rican politicians must be watching that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that they'll just continue to try to figure out where their interests overlap. I mean, Costa Rica has made itself a valuable partner in terms of fighting organized criminal activity as well as migration. And that's actually not just right now. Costa Rica had actually tried to cooperate with the United States on migration and had cooperated. I mean, we're going back easily, 7-8 years, right? So Costa Rica, had long kind of seen itself as a partner for the United States on those two issues. And I think that, Costa Rica is going to continue to kind of portray itself as we can help you on these two critical issues that are important to you. I think that the fact that the United States with other allies has been quick to change course rapidly, I think probably set up alarms in Costa Rica. So Colombia, I feel like, is a great example, right? So Colombia, you couldn't ask for a better ally for the United States than Colombia, maybe Panama, right? But I mean, if you think about regional allies, Panama and Colombia have long been kind of the key allies for the United States in the hemisphere. So when the United States, I think it was back in January or February, when the United States announces that if Colombia doesn't do exactly what it wants, it's going to have these tariffs immediately. And that kind of just sends up a bit of an alarm, right? If you're kind of, working in a country in Latin America and you're like, this is how the U.S. is treating its allies, you're going to think we better actually start looking for more allies, right? So, we're going to start to see Costa Rica, thinking about making sure that its relationship with China is strong. Also, probably, seeking to, deepen its relationship with other countries. Germany, for example, cooperates with Costa Rica quite a bit on environmental matters, right? So I think Costa Rica is most likely looking at how the United States is treating its other allies in the region and kind of thinking like we better have a plan B in case all of a sudden we are now in the ire of the US. Again, I think it's less likely that they would be because they've cooperated so extensively on drug trafficking and migration. But, with this administration, it's been quite unpredictable.
And of course, Costa Rica is not a country that creates problems for in comparison to neighbors and so on and so forth. It's not it doesn't really rock the boat. So hopefully, and so as we wind this down, Mary Fran, it seems to me that we are pointing. One thing that we come back to obviously is the identity. We come back to but inequality and marginalizations. Costa Rican institutions remain strong then, despite everything. This seems to be a success story.
Yes, absolutely. And when I was interviewing people who worked with both government and civil society in Costa Rica in July of 2024, one thing that they kept repeating was that Costa Rica has invested in strong institutions since 1949, right? So from the judicial perspective, for example, I was speaking with one official and she said, if you go anywhere in Costa Rica, the most remote area that's actually seems to be the most isolated, if that person actually has a problem that they need to report to police or the courts, they will be able to do so officially, right? So you don't see the same kind of inaccessibility to kind of the key democratic institutions in Costa Rica that you might see in other areas. There's no real part in Costa Rica that's completely cut off from being able to report a crime, being able to take a case to court, those types of things that people rely upon. Elections, another kind of, Costa Rica has that as a fourth branch of government. Those elections are, designed by a completely nonpartisan entity, right? So I think that when people think about institutions, it's not just that they're strong institutions that are kind of abstract. It's the institutions that people would use on a daily basis, right? So people, when they need assistance from police, courts, when they want to go vote, those institutions they recognize are strong. And they've been strong, there's been consistent investment with them since 1949. So Costa Rican elites, when they talk about things, are like, this is actually what's paying off, right? It's paying off because we've invested in making sure our institutions are strong, people can count on them. And that's kind of, making sure that our democracy is protected from some of these other regional trends.
Oh, what a relief! It's nice to hear this and end on let's say a positive note there. Although I would say that this on the whole, this has been a good conversation. Costa Rica, yes, there are challenges, but again, in the broader context, Costa Rica is going to be okay. Let's say, I think
that would be my guess. Yes, absolutely. If I was predicting, that would be what I would say.
We don't expect electoral violence in 2026.
No, I would be shocked if that happens.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolutely, revealing conversation. I'm happy to talk about Costa Rica in such a manner. We've been talking here on the LatinNews Podcast to Mary Fran T Malone, who is the professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of New Hampshire, where she teaches classes on democracy, comparative politics, and Latin American politics. Her research focuses on a crucial component of democracy, establishing the rule of law. Check out her 2023 book on security. It's called Making Police Reform Matter in Latin America. Mary Fran, thank you so much for your time here on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. This has been the LatinNews Podcast. Remember to check back in a fortnight's time for further interviews on subjects from the region. Goodbye.